Hello, I'm back twice in one weekend. Unusually prolific for me, but I thought I'd throw out, after the last, I suppose 2 videos really on the subject, I thought I'd just rattle off some first impressions, having watched on Friday night. I think Friday was when it was released on Netflix, after watching the new film of All Quiet on the Western Front. This is directed by Edvard Berger, based on, and I would emphasise, based on Erich Maria Remarque's obviously highly significant novel of the experience of a German soldier in the First World War. Now, this is the 3rd cinematic treatment of this book, the most recent one prior to that being 1979's adaptation. I think both the previous films, pretty much, as I remember them, pretty much a straightforward treatment of the content and the plot of the book. This new one deviates from that rather. It's quite a, I suppose, a loose adaptation in a number of ways. If you feel like a purist about it and are expecting a faithful treatment of the plot of this, you may struggle a bit. I mean, it did surprise me. I think I kind of expected it to pretty much follow the book, and it doesn't in certain ways. I mean, it's true to it in, I think it's certainly true to it in sentiment and I think in tension, but there are significant differences. Now, the new film employs this kind of, I suppose, dual narrative, where there's this kind of behind the scenes process of, I suppose, one of Germany's more progressive or liberal politicians at the time being actively involved in the behind the scenes peace negotiations, or working up to an armistice towards the late months of 1918. So there's this thread kind of away from the front lines of the character played by Daniel Brühl. Now, this isn't really a feature of the book, so it kind of necessarily takes away from. The new film has had to make certain economies because of that. You know, it's a film, not a mini-series, so it might have worked quite well as a mini-series now I think about it, but it's had to make certain economies in that you get, I think, much more of a précise account of Paul Baum, and I'm going to struggle to pronounce this now because my German is non-existent. As far as I could make out from the new film, his name would be pronounced Paul Bäumer. If I'm getting close there, don't shoot me down if not. But the story as it is in here gives quite a long and detailed account of Paul's transition from a sort of eager youth. He's still at school, I think sort of that A-levelish sort of age, 17. He's still basically a schoolboy with his head full of the kind of patriotic hoo-ha that's pumped into him and his classmates by Kantorek, their teacher, and the transition of him from that phase through to as he ends up a kind of pretty much a hardened frontline veteran by the end of it. And you get a lot less detail, I suppose, of that aspect of the story. For example, I was curious when I heard of this how they would treat the character of Himmelstoss, Corporal Himmelstoss, who he encounters in training. Himmelstoss is the classic rear echelon bully, but the character is given a little bit of a redemptive arc in the actual story. But unless he featured when I was on a pee break, I don't think it featured Corporal Himmelstoss at all. I was quite surprised. You didn't get actually much detail of the training process. So, yeah, like I say, it is quite different. You still have the situation of Paul Bäumer and his contemporaries all winding up in a platoon that's headed by, a very sympathetic character, which is Kaczynski, I think it's Kat he's known as. He's the kind of, I suppose, almost archetypal benign NCO who kind of takes these kids under his wing and, acclimatises them to the ways of frontline life, which of course is nothing like what they were given to expect. A brutal departure from what as, basic schoolboys that they were given to expect that they were getting into. It stays true to it on that front. The film makes a lot more significance. There's a sequence in which, I think given the logistics of German supply in the latter part of the First World War, and I have to emphasise incidentally that I'm not anything of an expert historian on that area, I've got sort of layman's knowledge maybe, but as far as I understand it anyway, the logistics on the German side in the latter part of the war was quite badly stretched, so, a bit of illicit foraging in the occupied territories would probably have been fairly standard. So there's this sequence where they enterprisingly break into a French farm holding, and it's a goose. A lot more significance is made of this in the new film. That side of it, I suppose, it gets a certain amount of focus in the film, but that kind of is at the expense of staying faithful to this story. I don't want to give too much away, but a great deal more significance is attached to this French farmhouse than has previously been the case. So I don't think it's necessarily a wrong thing to have gone off and done their thing with the story rather than stay strictly close to the original. That's not a sin in itself. There's pros and cons to it, I suppose. I think for me the bit that I struggled with, and I think I'm probably going to have to actually watch this again at some point, and I don't know if my opinions have yet fully settled on it after a first viewing, but the part that I kind of scratched my head over, I suppose, was the way the ending was written. Now it's kind of, the film's kind of constructed almost like this dual narrative seems to present this race towards the end in the closing days or hours even of the First World War, that you have this parallel behind the scenes working of these diplomats and politicians and high ranking military officers and the guys on the front line, and you kind of, and it works quite well in terms of suspense, that you're kind of hoping that the characters that you've come to know in the front line situation, against hope, we know how it's going to end for the most part, unless you're going in completely cold, but you're kind of hoping that in this kind of dual race towards that final hour of the war, that somehow the characters that you've come to care about might come through okay. Now again, I'm going to have to throw in some level of spoiler here. The way the film has kind of reinterpreted it is that a lot of the kind of crucial climax of this story is happening in the last hours, minutes even, before the armistice comes into effect, and it presents this situation where there's this, another of these behind the scenes characters is this real martinet kind of uptight German general type. Now I think he may be in there as a kind of cipher for the mindset that seemed to prevail at the end of the war and the years that followed it, that Germany's defeat in the First World War was the result of, it wasn't the result of technical military defeat, because they're still largely in foreign territory at the time of the armistice, but that they were stabbed in the back by unpatriotic or treacherous politicians. This became a kind of narrative that can be seen as the cause for a lot of the historical problems that followed, and maybe this senior officer figure in this is in there as a kind of cipher for that. But the climax of this is presented as the morning of the day of armistice, where they know at the 11th, at the stroke of 11 o'clock this comes into effect, and they got to put their guns down, and there's this last minute kind of blaze of glory gesture on this officer's part, which of course forces Paul Bäumer and what's left of his, he's just lost his friend Kat, so he's presumably not acting in his right mind, and kind of maybe doesn't feel the will to survive himself at this stage. But him and these guys, together with a sort of totally wet behind the ears influx of new recruits, are compelled to take part in this kind of you know, it's almost like this gesture in the interests of prestige that this officer forces them into, and you can see these dissenting voices, you know, because I believe there was a quite mutinous feeling amid the German military by that stage of the war, but you see these dissenting voices, you know, understandably. If someone sort of assembles your regiment in the yard at that time and says we're going to have one last go at it, you know, at fucking 10:30 in the morning, when something like that, when, you know, understandably there would be people saying fuck off, you know, and you see them kind of getting taken aside and summarily executed. Now, I can see this as being, like I say, emblematic of a certain mindset within the German military machine, but I don't know. I mean, maybe someone who's kind of more read than I am historically on this, I don't associate that with the reality, I suppose. I had the feeling that any kind of rash last minute actions on that day were more on the British or the American or possibly the French side, but not on the German side. I may not, you know, I may have this wrong, I don't know, but I don't associate anything like that with the Imperial German Army on that day. So I'm aware, for instance, I mean, if you used to visit the old, as it was before the refit, if you visited the Imperial War Museum, for instance, in one of the display cases at the end of the First World War section, you saw this, there was this kind of communique on, you know, it's like official Imperial German Army notepaper, and it was basically an official complaint that they'd put into the Allied High Command that an artillery battery had carried on firing at the German positions after the stroke of 11 o'clock. So I kind of associate that kind of thing on that day not so much with the German forces. I don't know historically how well that one really sits, and also it just strikes me that, I mean, the title of the book, All Quiet on the Western Front, I mean, if I'm getting this right in German, In Westfront Nichts Neues, pardon my pronunciation, but the whole implication of that, I thought, was that on the day that Paul's narrative comes to sad end, that it comes to, the implication is that this happens on a day when nothing is considered worth reporting on the part of the German military. It's the most ordinary day imaginable. So the communique says, yeah, nothing to report. Nichts Neues, right? So the way that's been rewritten, I think that was the bit I kind of struggled with, and it seemed to me that it had kind of been done in possibly in the interests of a sort of rather neat, dramatic. Well, you maybe see what I mean if you watch it. I mean, watch it. I would say see what you think. This is only my take on it. I did kind of struggle with the ending, I do have to say. But, you know, I'm not going to give this film a drubbing because I think it got a lot of things right as well. I think in terms of tone and mood and look and sentiment, I think it was pretty much on it. I mean, probably more even than the previous films, because I think technically filmmakers are probably better able, and also I think maybe audiences now are considered more able to be confronted with the grimness, I suppose, the absolute horror, the degrading, filthy, barbaric pool of shit that these kids just find themselves pitched into. I think this film gets that very right. There's sequences in which, you know, the actors, they don't even look, you know, they're caked in mud, and they're like, you know, it's like they've been reduced to these shit-caked savages, you know, in very little time, you know, from schoolboys to this medieval level of horrendous kind of butchery. There's a very memorable battle sequence in it in which the German regiment storms this French trench, and then against their expectations, they're counter-attacked by this formation of French tanks, which are represented by interesting choice actually, the French Saint-Chamond tank, which like I mentioned in a previous video, I don't believe Saint-Chamond was such a significant player on the French side, but they have this quite almost medieval aspect to them. They kind of have this look about them that, you know, the spectacle of these primordial mechanisms just rumbling towards you across a sea of shit and barbed wire, and that's a very effective sequence. Although you know, if I was to pick holes, you know, I kind of have the feeling that by that stage of the war, you know, if this is supposed to be in late 1918, I do think the German side would have had their methodology against tank attack sort of in place by that point. For instance, they would have been equipped to a certain degree with the tank Gewehr, which is like the big elephant gun thing that you know, it was an upstaged, an upscaled Mauser with this huge cartridge that, you know, was hell on an operator's shoulder, but could either penetrate or could cause, I can't remember what they call it when on those old First World War tanks, if a bullet hit the casing, if the bullet didn't actually penetrate, it would still cause this kind of, do they call it splash? There was a name for it. It would still cause this kind of spray of hot metal within the tank, even without penetrating it. It was just a reaction to the bullet hitting the hull. They would have had that, and also I think their artillery had figured that if they depressed certain of their artillery pieces, they were quite effective anti-tank weapons. So, but this sequence kind of betrays the troops as sort of almost naked against these things without that kind of support. But in terms of, you know, portrayal of just the absolute horror, it's quite effective. And, you know, in fact, they do manage to deal with a tank in a sort of crude way. You know, it's not like, you know, it doesn't portray these tanks as impregnable. They weren't, you know. So, but, you know, this wave of tanks is followed by flamethrowers, and again, it's in confronting the audience with the kind of barbarism, you know, of that weapon. I can't think of anything fucking worse. I mean, maybe the gas, but which, you know, is featured as well. That also gets a mention within this, but the employment of the flamethrower as a weapon, and there's a sequence in which I'd say it was used pretty gratuitously when it wasn't needed, and it's pretty fucking troubling, I've got to say. But that's the film doing its job. So I suppose quite timely in its release, not only for the, you know, the time of year that we're leading up to Remembrance Day, but, you know, that, well, you know, I suppose we're never far from war drums beating in some part of the world, but, you know, always worth a reminder that it's not the idea that you're sending 17-year-olds out to some field of glory. Always worth challenging, I believe. So anyway, you know, that's my first take on it. Like, again, I can't emphasise enough, not a historian on this, but I would say see for yourself. I would say see it. You know, I wouldn't let anything I've said put you off. I would say give it a whirl. It'll be interesting to see what you think. Anyway, thank you for watching, and hope you're doing well out there. See you soon, hopefully. Bye.